Well, welcome everyone. I'm excited about this morning for our advisors and some of our school staff to get an update on the FAFSA and really kind of navigating the financial aid process, because as Matt's going to talk about, things are changed this year and they're pretty much the same, but they're going to be different. So it really is a pleasure to introduce Matt DeSorger from the University of Vermont. He's Associate Director of Financial Aid and Financial Services. That'll give us an update as to on the FAFSA and really some tips to navigate the financial aid process. Matt co-presented at our national conference, and it was just a worthwhile session. Matt, I'm just so honored to have you share with us again to our audience, and we'll record this for folks that aren't here today. So Matt, I want to welcome you and turn it over to you and kick it off.
Yeah, thank you. Great to be here this morning, and I think there's a lot that we will be navigating, and appreciate the work that you all do in supporting students and families that are navigating this as well. So let me sort of share my screen here, and hopefully that's showing up for folks. And as I go through, I mean, if there are any questions, please just jump in and shout them out, and we'll certainly have time for questions at the end as well. But we can kind of dialogue as we go. So,
and Matt, just a point is, those that aren't here in the CFES office, you just unmute yourself and ask the question.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I want to talk about is what to anticipate, and I'll sort of break it up. First, a little bit about the timeline of the aid process for folks that are applying for fall 24 admission. And the timeline is, there's some timeline changes for this cycle. And then we'll talk a little bit about the process changes, some changes to the actual kind of process of filing. And then there's also some changes just to how need-based aid eligibility will be determined. So we'll kind of approach it in that way, sort of what's different about the timeline, what's changing about the process, what's changing about the sort of the formula and how aid eligibility is determined. So timeline-wise, we have just a tiny nugget of additional information versus when we had the conference a few weeks back. So the FAFSA for the 24-25 cycle will open by December 31st. The Department of Education is still using this by December 31st. I think everybody that is hearing that as on December 31st. The Department of Ed is still saying by, as if there's some small chance that it will be before that, but I think that is a very small chance. So we're really anticipating that this will be opening, on December 31st. If it's sooner than that, I don't think it would be by more than, a few days. And, this delayed start in this cycle, which first of all this is a 1 year, timeline change. So we do expect that in future years, we'll be back to the FAFSA opening on October 1st. This 1 year kind of timeline delay is really to accommodate the changes to the FAFSA, which is all geared around simplifying the process. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but streamlining the process and ultimately getting us to a place where students are able to better anticipate their aid eligibility further ahead of time. But there's changes to the systems and programs, and the Department of Ed has just needed some more runway to accommodate that. So that's sort of what's behind this delay. So it'll open December 31st. And, we also anticipate that there will be some further delays in terms of when schools begin to receive FAFSA information. So in a normal cycle, what happens is a student files their FAFSA, and right away they're able to kind of see the processed information, and schools typically receive the FAFSA details usually 3 to 5 days later. What we're being told by the Department of Ed is that schools should expect to start receiving student FAFSA information by the end of January. So there will be a bit of a lag time between when the FAFSA first opens and when schools are actually kind of receiving that information. And I'll talk a little bit more about what I think that means by way of award timelines. Just a couple of other notes that are not related to the FAFSA. Some schools do require that students also complete the CSS profile. The CSS profile is a supplemental aid application. It's one that students should only complete if they are asked to by schools that they're applying to. But if they do have schools that are looking for the profile, the profile is available now, and students could file that again if they're requested to. And if you are working with Vermont residents, Vermont residents are eligible to apply for our state grant fund, and that application is also available now. So there are some things that students could potentially be getting a jump on now, and then I think January will really be when things pick up steam.
That's probably also true. We've got multiple states like New York and other ones. Some people from Florida are in this. They should check and see if they can apply now to their states too. You talked about Vermont.
Yeah,
that's a whole separate process.
Right. And there are some states that, there are some states where there's no separate application for grant funding. It's automatic just based on the FAFSA. There are others that do require a separate application. And it's a good point that the timelines there are really going to vary state to state. So, I think once the FAFSA opens, and the way we're messaging this, we're going to be messaging for students to be filing in January. Students should plan to file the FAFSA in January, I think as soon as it's available. Having said that, I don't envy personally, like the first person in America to file the 24-25 FAFSA. They're probably not going to get a prize. They're probably, hopefully not, but they might, uncover a bug or a glitch or two that, that will need to be resolved. So I think our message is, for families to be filing in January, but we're certainly not going to be messaging to anyone like cancel your New Year's Eve plans and file on December 31st. Like I don't think there's going to be a prize there. So, but to be encouraging timely filing, and a lot of that, right, is we know that high school seniors who are applying to schools and may have to make a decision by May 1st, right? They want to see financial aid offers before they make their decisions. We want to be able to provide financial aid offers as soon as possible, and in order to do that, right, we're going to need that FAFSA information. A lot of schools have historically had FAFSA deadlines that could have been, in the mid to late January or early February timeline. And I can't speak for other institutions. I can talk a little bit about how we're navigating that here at UVM, where we're really trying to balance two things. We don't want students to panic or be feeling kind of pressed for time with these early deadlines. At the same time, we want to get FAFSA information so that we can provide financial aid offers, and deadlines do spur students to act. There are folks who just will not act in the absence of a deadline. So I think our messaging is really going to be less oriented around like, here's a deadline and there's problems if you miss that deadline, and more around file in January so that we can get you an on-time financial aid offer, or a financial aid offer as soon as possible. But again, students should be attentive to deadlines that that schools are listing, and I think there may be some fluidity to those as we see just how the FAFSA launch process unfolds. There are certainly some factors that are going to impact, when are students actually seeing financial aid offers. So I talked about how even though the FAFSA is going to open December 31st, we are not expecting at schools to be receiving that information until late January is what we're being told. So, that's certainly going to impact our timeline. Once we begin to receive those FAFSAs, schools have software vendors that are also working to catch up on these changes. And I think we'll also be really closely watching of our applicants, how many have filed their FAFSAs, right? Where, it will be challenging for schools to begin to issue financial aid offers if the sort of FAFSA filing rate is very slow. So, I think there are certainly things that could impact exactly when should students expect to see financial aid offers. It's hard for me to, I think here at UVM, we're really looking at, again, there's lots of variables, but it's hard for us to see how financial aid offers are issued, earlier than late February, at the maybe early March, again, with a lot of variables there. So again, I think that will be a fluid situation as schools are working to get the FAFSA information and then turn that around as quickly as possible, but with a lot of things that are changing here. All right, so I'm going to turn a little bit to sort of what's changing to just the process of filing the FAFSA. And here, I think, there really is really good positive news for students and families. A lot of the changes that are being made really are to make the process simpler. And I think this first one is key, right? So for a number of years now, the FAFSA has had an optional process that was available to some students and families where, as they were filing, the students could basically reach out from the FAFSA out to the IRS network, grab their tax information, and pull that back into the FAFSA. Again, that was optional, so families had to sort of opt into that. And it was available in many situations, but there were also many situations that it could not kind of accommodate. So it couldn't accommodate, folks that had amended their tax returns, or, cases where a student had parents who, filed separately, right? They were married, but filed separate tax returns, for example. So one of the big changes going into 24-25 is moving from that sort of optional data retrieval sort of tool to a direct and automatic data exchange between the FAFSA and the IRS. So with the 24-25 FAFSA, everybody who files will be required to authorize a direct exchange of their tax information over to the FAFSA. So what was optional is now basically an embedded part of the process. So every individual that's participating in a FAFSA, so the student, their parents, again, will need to authorize that connection between the IRS and the FAFSA. IRS information will be directly imported this will be both, it will accommodate more scenarios than in the past. So, we understand that folks, again, who have amended their tax return, right, they'll be able to make use of this process and will be getting the most up-to-date tax information. In the case of, families where either, a dependent student with two parents who filed separate tax returns, those parents will be able to individually bring their tax information into the FAFSA, where it will be, combined as needed. So they'll be able to make use of that. Similarly, if you have an independent student and they have a spouse, they'll be able to, separately bring in their tax information as needed. So we expect both more accurate information, more folks that can benefit from this. And again, this is then meaning that when their FAFSA is submitted, the information right from the get-go is validated and accurate, and they're not having to navigate which tax line aligns with which question on the FAFSA. We do know that there will be still some individuals that cannot, make use of this, which will include individuals who have filed a foreign tax return. It may also include folks who maybe filed a joint tax return, but have since separated or divorced. So there will still be folks who are manually entering information, but we do expect those numbers to be a lot smaller.
Nice.
With that, again, in the past, if you had a dependent student, right, you had the student, they would sign the FAFSA, and at least one of their parents would sign the FAFSA. There may now be cases where both parents have a role to assign the FAFSA and provide, authorization. Again, if there's two parental tax returns that need to be brought in, then both parents are going to need to provide that, that authorization to make sure that, again, they're aware that their tax information is being pulled in there. The other thing that I'll mention, which is a change, is which parent is filing the FAFSA in the case of divorce or separation. So the change is when a student's parents are divorced or separated, historically and through this current school year, to determine which parent you reported on the FAFSA, you would first look and say, in the last year, with which parent did I live the most? And so that lived with test was sort of the key. And that's now changing to which parent provided the most financial support in the last year. So from there, it remains the case that you kind of determine which parent is being reported on the FAFSA. And then if that parent has been remarried, right, that now is the family unit that gets reported. So that part is the same, but when you're making that sort of first decision of, which of my legal parents is subject to reporting, you're going to be looking at who provided the most financial support.
Thanks.
Another change that's being made is one that is, and this is where we'll kind of begin to move into some of the sort of math too, because there's the math that's changing under the hood, so to speak. So there's first a name change, and I think it's one that is long overdue. The long time result of filing the FAFSA has been the expected family contribution, or EFC. That was sort of the name given to the number that came out at the end of the formula. That name has always been problematic. The expected family contribution has really rarely accurately reflected what a student or family would actually pay, right? It has always been an index number, right? A number that schools and the federal government are using because we have a limited amount of aid dollars that we have to allocate. And, there's not as much aid as we would like to fully meet all students' needs. So we need some index with which to allocate that. And that's been the role that the EFC has always played. I think by calling it the expected family contribution rate, we know that created confusion of families who would then be looking at their actual financial aid offers and saying, hey, when I do this out, what I'm actually going to owe is something different, right? So in 24, 25 and beyond, we will no longer be talking about the EFC, we'll be talking about the Student Aid Index, right? So we have a name change, first of all, and I think that's long overdue, and again, more accurately reflects what this number is really representing. But it's not just a change in the name, there's also some changes underneath in terms of how that number is calculated. And I'll try to just give kind of a high level of that. Again, these changes to the formula are largely in the name of simplifying the process. So, the student aid index is calculated based on income and asset information from students and families. And what the government is doing is they're really saying, to the extent that we need income information on the FAFSA, let's make that income information that we can get directly from the IRS. So there are a number of sources of untaxed income that families have had to report on the FAFSA in the past, which are not things that are on a tax return, and that will no longer be requested, right? So that the income that is being captured is primarily coming just from that exchange with the IRS. So, in the past, folks have had to report, if they were in the military or clergy and were getting kind of an allowance for housing, they've had to report that. If individuals were getting, disability or other non-educational VA benefits, they would report those. Workers' compensation, right, was self-reported. Technically, students have long been required to report, I got $50 from grandma on my birthday and my birthday card, right? I don't know how many students were reporting that, but technically, that was one of the things that was asked for. Those are all being removed, right? Because those were things that families or students were self-reporting, and they're being removed so that the income information is primarily flowing through the tax return and isn't something families really have to think about. It'll just be automatically sent through. There are a couple of exceptions. There are some things that are some untaxed income that will still be reported. Primarily, child support received will still be reported on the FAFSA, as will foreign income that was earned but not subject to U.S. taxes. So it's not that all untaxed income is going away, it's just that it's being reduced. So again, limiting the number of questions there. The other change deals with small business and farm value. So for probably the past, I don't know, maybe 10 to 12 years or so, you have not had to report on the FAFSA the equity that you had in a small family-owned business or a family farm. You will now need to report those as assets on the FAFSA. Overall, the FAFSA and the student aid index formula, they remain primarily driven by student income and assets and parent income. Parent assets do have an impact, but the formula is much more heavily driven by parent income. If you have seen kind of any news articles about the changes to the FAFSA process, the thing that has been highlighted the most, and that I want to spend a little bit of time talking about, deals with families where there are 2 or more children in college simultaneously. The EFC formula, the expected family contribution formula, kind of at the last step, you figured it out, and then you said, okay, if you have 2 kids in college, we'll divide that number in half. If you have 3 kids in college, we'll divide that number by 3. And so that did potentially provide, a benefit to families where there were multiple students in college simultaneously. The SAI formula does not do that. The number of children in college simultaneously does not have that direct impact. And there are absolutely some families that will be impacted by that, but I do think that the way that has been portrayed in the media has perhaps induced more panic than might really be needed. So for one thing, I would note that again, the EFC was never, or in many cases, was not exactly what a family was going to pay for college costs. It was, again, that sort of index number. So I think some articles that talked about like, oh, there's families where their costs are going to double. That's really not necessarily the case at all. A family wasn't necessarily going to pay what their EFC indicated to begin with. And the fact that the SAI might be, higher, maybe twice as high, doesn't necessarily mean that family's, net costs are going to be twice as high. So I think partly understanding that the EFC was never exactly what a family was going to pay in many cases, there's a mitigating factor there. The other piece to understand is that this is not the only change to the formula, right? So part of the formula looks and says, okay, what was the family's total income? Let's capture that. We're going to capture it from their tax information, right? Then the formula says, well, we know that a family's income is not all available for college costs. Families have all sorts of other expenses. So the formula automatically sort of walls off a certain amount of family income, just to recognize that there are basic costs and expenses that every family is facing. And one of the changes that's being made going into next year is the government is increasing the amount of family income that they are, again, sort of quote unquote walling off and not factoring towards college costs. And so that to some extent sort of offsets, some of the change, given that they're not dividing by the number in college. I think to some extent it's also worth noting that that this process of dividing the EFC by 2 for the number of students that you had in school at the same time really never equitably accounted for the fact that a family who has 2 students who will be in college but not at the same time still likely has the same overall college expenses, right? They're just not incurring them simultaneously. So I think this sort of levels that playing field to some extent as well. So we had changes to the name of the student aid index and changes to how that's calculated. The government is also making some changes to how federal Pell Grant eligibility is determined. And the goal here is to allow students and families to better look into the future and anticipate whether they might be eligible for a federal Pell Grant. So currently, in order to know, am I eligible for a federal Pell Grant, I have to know what my expected family contribution is going to be. And, there's a lengthy guide that talks about the exact math that leads to that expected family contribution. So I'd have to go through that, 10 or 15 page workbook and figure out my EFC, or maybe use an online calculator. And then I'd have to get out, the federal chart that says if your EFC is X, then here's your federal Pell Grant. It's fairly opaque to students and families. It would be very challenging for a student as a sophomore or junior or senior in high school before applying for college and financial aid to look and say, am I going to be eligible for federal grant funds? And so the government is changing the Pell Grant eligibility process to allow it to be more transparent. And so it is moving forward. The Pell Grant eligibility is really based on adjusted gross income and the federal poverty level. And so, if I just briefly put up, and there's a lot of numbers on this chart, but basically what we're looking at is, if we look in this middle, kind of the middle column here, max Pell Grant AGI limit, right? We can see that if in the top grid here, if a student, if we have a dependent student and they're in a single parent household, and there's a family size of 3, they will qualify for the maximum Pell Grant if that parent's adjusted gross income is under $51,818. So the changes are really tying Pell Grant eligibility to, for dependent students, parent adjusted gross income. And that allows for charts like this where a family could, or a student could look and say, okay, I'm a sophomore or junior in high school. My parents adjusted gross income is, 50,000, single parent, family size of 3. Yes, I'm still a year or 2 away from completing the FAFSA, and our, parent income could change, but if it stays about the same, it looks like I'm, eligible or in the Pell Grant eligibility range. So that's, and again, the column on the far right would tell you, okay, are you eligible for at least the minimum, amount of a federal Pell Grant? So you've got kind of a range there, where if that same family of 3, single parent household, their AGI is under 74.8, then I'm going to qualify for at least some Pell Grant funding, maybe not the maximum amount, but there's going to be some of that federal grant funding available. So I think as this process unfolds and as, once this is fully implemented, you'll see more charts in this vein that hopefully allow high school students to better look and say like, oh, I might qualify for some federal grant funds. Maybe I should apply for financial aid, right? I always worry about those folks who write off the process before they even apply, right? And so maybe this helps folks more see that, there may be some federal grant funding available.
And that's good for a lot of our populations we serve, from our low income area. In addition, there's the Pell Grant. So
right, exactly. And I think
nice benefit for us.
Rather than that being something that is only revealed kind of at the very end of the process, right? To put, and again, it's not, again, if you're a freshman or first year or sophomore in high school, your income's going to change, but over time, but at least you've got kind of some window of like, oh, it looks like I could see myself in that arena. I do want to just give a brief note on net price calculators, which many of you may be familiar with. They are a tool that have been available for a number of years now. But in this particular cycle, I really want to sort of introduce a word of caution around those net price calculators. So they are a federal requirement. Schools are required to have those available. They generally will reflect, the way a school awarded and processed financial aid, either the last, the prior year, or maybe 2 years back. And in most cases, although schools, funding and aid strategies can change from year to year, usually, well, the way we did it last year would be a good ballpark of how we might be doing it next year. And so, students go through that process and can get, an estimate of their, both scholarship and need-based aid award. Because of the number of changes to the FAFSA formula, right? The changes to how Pell Grant eligibility is determined, a financial aid offer based on 23-24 processes and an estimate of 24-25, could be very different. So I think the accuracy of those need-based calculations is probably going to vary very widely this cycle. So, I think a lot of us in the, aid world with the changes that were happening thought, well, maybe we'll be able to just kind of take those down for this cycle because they may not be as accurate as normal. But, that requirement was not waived. So, to the extent that you have students or families that are using those, I would just kind of have that word of caution that, they should still go through the aid process and anticipate that the results could be different. Ultimately, kind of just some kind of closing thoughts on, again, how students and families can maximize aid opportunities. Definitely, monitoring what information they're getting from the schools that they're interested in. I think, planning to file the FAFSA in January, being mindful of any deadlines that schools are setting. But I think, again, our message is just going to be, filing in January. And then watching for, schools may be asking for some additional information. So watching for that and following up in a timely manner. One thing that hasn't changed, right, is that there's still no essay section on the FAFSA. And, I think anytime you have a student or family that sort of is wishing that there were, right? Like, I wish there were an essay section so I could explain this extenuating circumstance or explain how, family income has changed, or, what have you. Anytime a family is feeling that way, they should surface that to the schools that they're working with. Not all extenuating circumstances are things that we can act upon, and not all things that we can act upon end up changing the end result. But we don't know to kind of be engaging in that conversation with a student unless they bring it to our attention. So, it never hurts to just, and again, if a student is working with multiple schools because they haven't narrowed in on where they'll be enrolling, write up kind of a general paragraph of kind of, here's what's going on, right? A parent has been laid off or changed jobs, or parents separated, and just send that off to the schools that they're working with. Just email that to the financial aid offices, and that will then kick off any review process that those schools have. Ultimately, students want to get those financial aid offers so they can then evaluate their, kind of net cost information as they look to make their decisions. And then I did, again, I don't know kind of the range of communities that folks are working with, but I did note a couple of sort of Vermont specific items there in terms of local based funding. And I think certainly, we encourage students to really mine any local community based scholarships that are out there. Interesting really hearing that in a lot of cases, it's getting harder for some of these local scholarships to just get applicants. So I think that can be a place where there's some resources and where you're also not competing maybe against a lot of other individuals. So that is, those are the slides that I had. I'm happy to kind of take any questions, or if folks wanted some more detail on any of that, or yeah, I'll throw it open to the group.
Well, Matt, first of all, thank you. Here's one of my takeaways. There's going to be all kinds of ripple effects from the changes going on. First of all, it's going to put a little bit more stress on our financial aid offices like yours with a shorter window. But I'm also seeing with the changes of that, so many, like you talked about, we really pushed the private scholarships and the organizations beyond that. Many of them in the past required the FEC. So we need to get that done so we can get it to their deadlines, because we know there's a lot of unused scholarship money out there in the private world that we need to tap into. But first of all, thank you for that, with the impact on the Pell, the change of the deadlines. It's going to be a little delayed. Families getting the offers back from school is going to be a little bit later. Any questions from anybody in our audience?
Matt, I have a question. Institutional private scholarships, whatever, UVM or Ithaca College, they have a targeted scholarship for this program. We should be encouraging students to do that stuff now, correct? That won't be impacted based on
right. Yeah. So again, I can sort of speak for kind of the UVM angle, and every institution's a little bit different, but we here at UVM have both funding for merit-based scholarships and funding for need-based grant funding from the university. So for our merit-based scholarships, which is not tied to FAFSA information, and here at UVM, that's not something students have to actually apply for. If you apply for admission, we automatically look to see if you are qualifying for merit scholarships, and if you are, our timeline for that, it has not changed. You will find out about merit scholarships basically when you're admitted for, or when you're notified that you're admitted to the university. So you'll have that information ahead of time. I think, if a student is working with a school that has an application process for merit scholarships, they should absolutely be looking at, what is that deadline? And some of those deadlines may be the same as they always were, right? So, because those merit dollars are not necessarily tied to the FAFSA. So, and then again, here at UVM, right, that other bucket of funding that's grant-based, that's tied to the FAFSA, students won't be really seeing that piece of the puzzle until, again, sometime in the spring. So I think it's multifold. One, it's looking at what should I be applying for now, and then two, like we will be messaging again. I think about our UVM applicants who maybe they're admitted, they get notified of a merit scholarship, but then to know like that's not necessarily the full picture, right? If you've applied for need-based aid, you've got a part of the picture, but you maybe don't want to make your decision just yet, right? You want to look and see, okay, well, what does it look like once I have the need-based aid as well. And so I think helping students navigate, when do I have a complete picture, and now I can evaluate costs and make a decision there.
Nice. Anybody else have any other questions? Wow. Matt, again, I can't thank you enough for the oversight. The only drawback, this is the first time in 12 years I'm not completing the FAFSA because all my kids get out of school. But I heard it's gonna.
You could do it just for fun, right?
It wasn't fun when I did it for real, but hey, it made college affordable for my kids.
Exactly.
Exactly. And I loved your insight. Check your schools where you're applying. What are their deadlines to make sure you get the FAFSA in? Pursue the merit scholarships now, because those are based upon merit, not need. And when you get the merit, that's the starting point, not the end line.
Exactly.
Talked about changes to the Pell. You talked about if things change, communicating with the school. I got a sense of the changes that I've seen is school financial aid officers are there to work with their students. It's not us versus them, which is kind of how some people feel. And I just see ripple effects going all over through the financial aid world, but with some good changes.
Yep, absolutely. I think it certainly will not be a dull cycle for us. So, but ultimately, I think we're here to support students and families as are you, and I appreciate all the work that you folks are doing. Again, just kind of getting students thinking about college, kind of again, it's about getting them through the process and so that they can make kind of an informed decision. So if you do end up with other questions, I'm sure if you get those to Ron, you've got my contact information. You can certainly relay those, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, we'll channel it all through us. But again, Matt, in closing, I can't thank you enough. It was an invaluable experience. It's going to be a learning process for so many of us, including the universities. And again, I want to thank you for being a great partner with us and our programs. And I wish you the best with all these changes to get your awards out for your incoming class.
Yeah,
so,
happy to be here. I hope everyone has a great rest of your week.
Good. Thanks, Matt, and happy holidays to you and your family.
Thanks, the same.
Thanks, everyone.